All hail Supreme Court Associate Justice Neil Gorsuch and the confirmation that the Democrats have officially lost their bleeping minds. Let's follow last week's narrative, shall we? We begin with National Review editor Rich Lowry. On April 4th, so that would have been last Tuesday, Chuck Schumer is gearing up to hurt the country and his party. It is the dumbest filibuster of all. Now, throughout its history, the United States Senate has experienced disgraceful filibusters, Strom Thurmond against the 1957 Civil Rights Act, for example, entertaining filibusters, such as Huey Long in 1935 reciting a fried oyster recipe, and symbolic filibusters, such as Rand Paul making a point about drone strikes in 2013. But the filibuster that Chuck Schumer, remember this was Tuesday last week, so it was before the filibuster vote. The filibuster that Chuck Schumer is about to undertake against Judge Neil Gorsuch's nomination to the Supreme Court is perhaps the institution's dumbest ever. It won't block Gorsuch. It will not establish any important jurisprudential principle, and it won't advance Democrats' strategic goals. Indeed, it will do precisely the opposite. A Gorsuch filibuster would be an act of sheer partisan pique and spite against the wrong target with the wrong method at the wrong time. The Democrat effort to portray Justice Gorsuch as out of the mainstream has fallen flat, to euphemize it enormously. He has the support of Barack Obama's former Solicitor General, Neil Katyal. He got the American Bar Association's highest rating. He's been endorsed by USA Today. He will even receive the votes of at least 3 Democrat senators. Some radical, huh? From the moment of his announcement by Donald Trump to the very last question at his confirmation hearings, Gorsuch has been an exemplary performer, whose deep knowledge has been matched by his winning temperament. The attack on him as an enemy of the little man is based on a few decisions where he clearly followed the law, even though it resulted in an unsympathetic outcome. Much has been made of a case involving a driver for Trans Am Trucking who had pulled over on the side of the road in freezing temperatures and, fearing for his safety, drove off in defiance of a direct order of a supervisor. Days later, he was fired. Alphonse Madden claimed that claimed that the company had violated a whistleblower protection under federal law. In a dissent from the decision of the 10th Circuit, Gorsuch carefully argued that the statute's protections didn't apply to the trucker, although he stipulated that it might be fair to ask whether Trans Am's decision was a wise or kind one. Now, if Schumer upholds the filibuster against Gorsuch, and he tried, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell will almost certainly exercise the so-called nuclear option, eliminating the filibuster for Supreme Court nominations, which he did. Schumer portrays this as an act of procedural vandalism against the Senate, although he has no standing as vindicator of Senate tradition. First, a partisan filibuster against a Supreme Court nominee is unprecedented. Lyndon Johnson's nominee for Chief Justice, Abe Fortas, was successfully filibustered by a bipartisan coalition. Second, Democrats already nuked the filibuster for other nominations besides the Supreme Court back in 2013, if y'all will recall, with Chuck Schumer's support at the time. Finally, Democrats talked openly about how they'd use the nuclear option if Republicans filibustered a Supreme Court nomination by a prospective President Hillary Ronin Clinton. In other words, it's partisan tribalism all over again. It never goes away. It's always the same. It never changes. Now, in short, Democrats are departing from the Senate's longtime practices and exhoriating the GOP for responding with a tactic that Democrats themselves pioneered. See, it's okay for them. Not okay for the other tribe, but it's okay for them. And vice versa, of course. Process questions are always a festival for partisan hypocrisy. This is still a bit much. Regardless, Ed Whelan of the Ethics and Public Policy Center notes that there isn't much of a rationale for keeping the filibuster for Supreme Court nominees if it has already been eliminated for all other nominations. Now, putting all the... And of course, you know why the Democrats didn't nuke it for the Supreme Court level. It's because they didn't think they'd have to. I guarantee you, if they had still been in the majority in the Senate last year and Merrick Garland's nomination came up, Dirty Harry Greed, long may he be retired, would have nuked it in a heartbeat. Guaranteed. Now, putting all this aside, a Gorsuch filibuster doesn't even serve Schumer's narrow interests. Besides placating a left-wing resistance to Trump that is demanding it. It will be shrewder for Schumer, okay, that's an interesting mouthful, to keep his options open for a future nominee. See, remember, Neil Gorsuch took the place of the late Antonin Scalia. So this was just maintaining the status quo. This wasn't tipping the Supreme Court further toward constitutionalism. And given the age of some of the justices, well, on the constitutionalist side, Clarence Thomas, and then Anthony Kennedy is a swing vote, but oh my goodness, Stephen Breyer, he's a geezer now. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who's a little more than a mummy. I don't mean mommy, I mean mummy. I mean, you could see one or two of the liberal seats open up, and now, it's a crapshoot as to who Donald Trump would nominate, but if he were to pull another Gorsuch or two, that's when they should have kept their that is the thing for which they should have kept their powder dry. Husbanded, conserve their ammunition. Instead, they just shot their wad on a nomination that was not going to tip the balance further against them. Now, if there's another vacancy, perhaps Trump will nominate a lemon. It's always possible. Or the Republicans won't be so united, or the higher stakes of a conservative nominee replacing a liberal justice will create a different political environment. In these circumstances, it's possible to imagine Democrats filibustering and Republicans not managing to stick together to exercise the nuclear option. Well, maybe, but now we may never know, and we won't. Because Chuck Schumer is about to make Senate history for astonishing short-sightedness. Kevin Williamson was next up on last Tuesday, April the 4th, at National Review, calling the word politicized the dumbest word in early 21st century political parlance. Now, a little more than 20 years ago, the Texas legislature was afire with controversy surrounding a redistricting project. Advertising my ignorance of the process, Williamson writes, I asked a veteran state legislator at the time whether he thought the redistricting process was politicized. No, he explained, it isn't politicized, it's political. Redistricting is the most political thing a legislature does, he said. and the scales fell from Kevin Williamson's eyes. Politicized may be the most abused and least understood word in our political lexicon. The New York Times complained that certain policies of the George W. Bush administration politicized health care. Yeah, they really said that. Nancy Pelosi, whose ability to keep a straight face is not natural, once lamented the politicization of the Justice Department. Boyd Matheson, a conservative activist and former chief of staff to Senator Mike Lee, a junior senator from Utah, charges that Harry Reid politicized the workings of the Senate. Myron Ebell, who oversaw the Trump regime's EPA transition, why aren't they getting rid of it, abolishing it altogether, says the agency relies on politicized science. Barack Obama, answering critics who accused him of ghoulishly exploiting sensational shootings, said that such episodes are something we should politicize. It's honest about it. Some of these complaints make sense and some do not. The Washington Post reports that Neil Gorsuch has experienced a highly politicized confirmation hearing. Senator Lindsey Graham joined in, criticizing Democrats for politicizing the confirmation process. We're taking the nomination process to a place it was never intended to go by the framers of the Constitution, he said. Alexander Hamilton must be, or would be, rolling in his grave. Close quote. It's interesting he cited Alexander Hamilton instead of Madison, some of the, well, Madison's enough, right? I was about to say Jefferson, but Jefferson had no hand in writing the Constitution. He wrote the Declaration of Independence. But if Hamilton did not intend for the process to be political, why would he have entrusted it to a bunch of, pardon me for noticing, politicians? That matters of public concern are politicized is not a defect of republicanism. It is part of the design. That is how the Republican small r process works. Different constituencies within the polity disagree about the best way to regulate health insurance, or about how abortion should stand under the law, or about what is the best way to raise revenue for the federal government. Elected representatives fight and negotiate and make speeches and politic the issue until some sort of resolution is reached, or isn't. And then the electorate goes to the polls to render judgment. This is a process that has some problems, to be sure. Notice the absence of any mention of the states in that process, because the states were stripped of representation in Congress, specifically the United States Senate, by the 17th Amendment to the Constitution, which should be repealed, but I digress. This is a process that has some problems, to be sure. Ignorance is the natural and rational state of the voter. Discrete issues are bundled together in a way that makes disaggregating them difficult or impossible. Tribalism is more powerful than analysis. Voters are no more likely to be virtuous citizens than are their representatives. Opinion changes quickly in response to events that are partly or entirely exogenous to public policy. The inevitable cliche here, often attributed to Winston Churchill, is democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those others that have been tried from time to time. But that does not get at the whole truth. It is not that there is no alternative to the politicized way of doing things. Most of the good things we enjoy in this world are the result of markets and other spontaneous orders, not of politics. But there is no alternative to it when relying on the public sector. Now, that is not a bad thing, necessarily. The Supreme Court, acting in its role as illegitimate super-legislature and scriptural council, from time to time attempts to remove some item of controversy from the political sphere, in other words, the electoral sphere, as it did when it yanked a constitutional right to abortion out of its penumbra in 1973. That did not neutralize abortion as a political issue or elevate it to some new plane of existence in which it is subject only to a divine wisdom superior to politics. It simply took Republican, small r, accountability and the Republican voice out of the equation. Sometimes that is the right thing to do. The aforementioned James Madison and the other founding fathers of the Constitution included a Bill of Rights in the Constitution precisely to that end. Remember, the Constitution is a positive document in that it tells the federal government, okay, this is what you are authorized to do and nothing else. Whereas the Bill of Rights was essentially the opposite. It said, okay, in the Bill of Rights, this is what you can't do. These are all the things that hands off for the federal government. The Bill of Rights is, properly understood, a list of stuff you idiots cannot be trusted to vote on. We want to censor that guy. Too bad. No, we really, really want to. And there's a bunch of us. Too bad. We're the majority. Too bad, etc. Now, sometimes you need the Republican contest. Knowing what ought to be subject to plebiscitary judgment and what ought to be above or outside of formal Republican processes is a big part of political wisdom, which has not grown plentiful since the 18th century. Quite the opposite. Now, at the moment, we stood that wisdom on its head, lamenting the inevitably political actions of the political bodies while accepting, sometimes gleefully and sometimes with despair, the politicization of those institutions that ought to be outside of politics, like the Supreme Court and federal bureaucracies chief among them. Of course, the Democrats' attempt to prevent the nomination of Neil Gorsuch to the Supreme Court is a political part of a political process. Of course, the Republican response to this will be political, and one hopes entirely ruthless, which it was. I know, right? Astonishing. Presidents politicize everything they touch, every room they enter, and every subject about which they speak. President George H.W. Bush managed to politicize broccoli during his tenure. Of course, the Texas legislature will have an eye on politics when it engages in redistricting. Redistricting is a political process, one whose character is the direct result of the ordinary Republican, small r, processes by which the members of state legislatures are elected. A politicized House committee is a House committee functioning as intended. A politicized IRS is a menace to liberty and democracy that ought to be handled with the seriousness of a foreign invasion. You see, the great progressive conceit is that experts can scientifically manage human affairs the way expert managers run a factory. One of the amusing aspects of the current battle over redistricting, Democrat concern about so-called gerrymandering very closely tracks the Republican ascendancy in the state legislatures, is that progressive critics complain that today's redistricting is different from the redistricting that happened back when Democrats controlled most state legislatures because Republicans are too good at it. The development of new software tools has been a real boon to the modern psephological engineer. And what is proposed as an alternative? Different software designed and implemented by experts whose work is not politicized. Well, in other words, politicized means the other tribe succeeding politically. That's what politicized means. Now, part of the problem is that many Americans do not understand the architecture of our constitutional order. Another part of the problem is that some Americans do understand the architecture of our constitutional order and hate it, or at least resent the fact that it keeps them from doing what they want. Ding, 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 ding. That is why we have so many Democrats at the moment dreaming up ways around the First Amendment, prosecuting those with non-conforming views about climate change under spurious fraud allegations, censoring films critical of Democrat candidates in the name of campaign finance reform, and pursuing felony charges against pro-life activists engaged in the age-old practice of undercover investigative reporting. Remember David DeLeeden last week? State of California filed like 15 felony charges against him, and it's just blatant political persecution. I mean, here, and on that topic, as an aside, let us praise Kevin Drum of Mother Jones, one of the increasingly rare voices on the left who stands for freedom of speech, even for those with whom he disagrees. Credit where credit is due. It is why Democrats habitually attempt to shut down the inevitably political debate over climate change policy with high-handed declarations that capital S science has spoken, capital S science having partly displaced the capital H history of the mid-century Marxists, mid-20th century, and their epigones? Yeah, okay, let's go with that. Though not so much that Barack Obama did not feel the need to proclaim himself on the right side of capital H history when he ran out of arguments. Now, people tend to complain about things being politicized most intensely when the politics is going against them. And the Democrats seem to just be getting the news that Barack Obama's remarkable self-centeredness made him very, very good at winning elections for himself. The rest of the Democrat Party is in pretty piss-poor shape. And the question they face in the immediate future is not whether to politicize the confirmation of Neil Gorsuch, but whether to do so in a stupid and self-destructive way, attempting to do from their current minority position what Republicans did to poor old Merrick Garland for excellent political reasons that Democrats have employed before from their majority position. The problem with that isn't that it is political, but that it is a terrible idea. Now, people will speechify about statesmanship, about high principle and patriotism, and setting aside politics to come together to do the right thing. Now, when you hear that kind of talk, put on your hazmat suit. Say what you will about a bare-knuckles political fight, but it is more honest than the alternative. Fast forward 2 days to last Thursday, April the 6th, Mushroom Cloud Day in the upper chamber of the United States Congress. Kevin Williamson again with a great headline, "Play with fire, get nuked." And it's not like they couldn't see it coming from months away. The continuing contraction of the filibuster results from its continuing misuse. Mitch McConnell did the right thing by deploying the nuclear option, taking away the filibuster as a tool of Democrat obstruction in the matter of Neil Gorsuch's nomination to the Supreme Court. But we should take a moment to mourn the filibuster nonetheless. And we ought to take a much longer moment to mourn the collapse of a political culture that produced leaders with senses of responsibility sufficient to be trusted with such a tool. And we sometimes speak of organizations that run like a fine-tuned machine. Our federal government is not one of those organizations, though it is, as republics go, arguably the finest machine going and the oldest extant design, in that it is a little like the Porsche 911. Do you know what the most expensive performance option currently offered on a Porsche 911 is? Superior brakes. As passengers in Kevin Williamson's beloved 1982 Honda Prelude learned from time to time, an excellent machine that can accelerate but cannot stop provides a dangerous and terrifying ride. for the skiing, downhill skiing equivalent. See the late Sonny Bono. Watch out for that ooh tree! That's what downhill skiing is. It's not skiing, it's stopping. You're putting all your work into stopping yourself from zooming out of control and winding up like Sonny Bono did. Now, the Senate, with its minority empowering rules and procedures, is one of the federal government's most important breaks. Every branch has a break. Separation of powers, checks and balances. The president has his veto. The Supreme Court is pretty much all break. And the legislative branch, well, it's not supposed to have that much power. And the legislative branch has a complex braking mechanism. It's divided against itself, with the unruly and robustly democratic, small d, House often frustrated by design by the Senate, which once upon a time represented the states, and which, here it is, which before the direct election of its members had an even less democratic character, small d, than it does today. And again, the 17th Amendment is a scar on the Constitution and one of the worst of the idealistic measures of the capital P progressive era. Surely Republicans looking at the current situation in the state legislatures must lament it. Oh boy. It wouldn't be 52-48, I guarantee you that. Without the 17th Amendment, and just as a review, the 17th Amendment changed Senate elections from state legislatures to direct election of the people. Without the 17th Amendment, Republicans would have a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate. Or close to it. It wouldn't be 52-48. It would be, they would have probably in or around 60 seats, maybe more. So, anyway, the committee structure is another important accelerator. Now, the filibuster gets a bad rap in no small part because Democrats have used it to nasty ends. The most infamous filibuster was Strom Thurmond's 24-hour-plus assault against Republican civil rights legislation, being shepherded through Congress by the Eisenhower administration with the assistance of Richard Nixon. Huey Long, the subtropical Bernie Sanders, used the filibuster to keep control over patronage jobs in Louisiana. I personally prefer the Republican filibuster, especially the one during which Senator Rand Paul attempted to browbeat his less courageous colleagues into submission by reading them Kevin Williamson's columns. That was a good filibuster, but at least it was an actual filibuster, not this procedural thing where, no, we don't give, we're going to vote against closure and then you don't get closure. BS. You're going to filibuster, filibuster. Hold the floor and don't let it go. There haven't been real filibusters. Oh, gosh. Ted Cruz did one a few years ago. Rand Paul did one around the same time. But nobody does actual filibusters anymore because it would be too much work. George Will had a column last week where he suggested that the real filibuster reform would be to take away this procedural rule crap and require actual holding the floor, talking until they fell over, unconscious. Yeah, that would put a real brake on the abuse of the filibuster because they'd actually have to work at it. But I digress. Senator Paul was working to draw attention to the serious question of the U.S. government's conducting drone assassinations around the world, a project that has included the extrajudicial killing of U.S. citizens. Now, that's a real, it's an issue, I guess. Senator Alphonse D'Amato, remember him? Yeah, a Republican, was actually a senator from New York State at one time. Yeah, a New York Republican. Remember those? Read his colleagues the phone book in his stand against a military spending bill, and Fighting Bob LaFollette, a Wisconsin Republican who was not as fond of fighting as his nickname implied, filibustered against a measure that he believed would draw the United States into the war against Germany in 1917. The point is, those were real filibusters, where they held the floor and talked until they were unconscious. And then they kept on talking. That is consequential stuff. Chuck Schumer is full of something else. There isn't a serious case to be made against Neil Gorsuch, who was unanimously confirmed to the federal bench, the 10th Circuit. Not a single Democrat holdout only a few years ago. Democrats might complain that this is only a tit-for-tat payback for Republicans doing to Barack Obama what Joe Biden dreamed of doing to George H.W. Bush in 1992. And the people who conducted the shameful jihad against the late Robert Bork, and who manufactured a phony sexual harassment case against Clarence Thomas, can hardly cry. Remember the high-tech lynching? Can hardly cry, "They started it!" You want to complain about the ugliness surrounding Supreme Court nominations, go dig up Ted Kennedy's wretched old bones and yell at them. But here's the thing. Congress is known to do really dumb things from time to time. Muppet newsflash. Majorities often are even dumber than minorities, and at the risk of resorting to shallow bipartisanship, there is no reason to believe that a stampeding herd of elephants is any less of a danger to our liberties and property than is a stampeding herd of jackasses. It would be good to have an instrument empowering the occasional sober senator to stand up from time to time and say, "I know that there are 51 of you in favor of this, but I am not entirely sure that we should trade the contents of Fort Knox for a bag of magic beans." A filibuster, a majority, a committee chairmanship, a loaded gun. Each of these deserves to be handled with care and with prudence, a commodity for which there simply is no substitute. George Washington is supposed to have said that government is like fire, a dangerous servant and a fearful master. Sometimes people who play with fire get burned, or, as last Thursday, they get nuked. Jonathan Tobin, in kind of an epilogue to the Gorsuch confirmation saga, put it in a very unique way. Nuking the filibuster was the only way to get back to 9. Nuclear option was the only way to confirm a justice in an age of hyper-partisanship, hyper-tribalism. Now the vote was held, and the sky didn't fall. The liberals solemnly proclaimed that tradition and even the fabric of the republic were imperiled. When the Senate moved to change the rules to allow a simple majority to get a vote on a Supreme Court nomination, the result was hardly revolutionary. Filibusters on nominations are a relatively recent innovation and were almost unknown until Democrats sought to stop George W. Bush's appellate court picks. But the most important point about what has just happened is that it was absolutely necessary. We can debate which side is more at fault in getting us to the point where court confirmations have become a steel cage, hell in a cell partisan wrestling match. But going nuclear was going to have to happen if we were ever to get back to 9 justices, no matter who had won the 2016 presidential election or which party controlled the Senate. Like the Republicans who spouted endless sermons about the virtues of a so-called tradition after then-Majority Leader Dirty Harry Greed ended the filibuster for lower court nominations, Democrats are declaring today's vote to be the effective end of the United States Senate, if not of the American Republic itself. This is absurdity on wheels. And it ill becomes the party that turned Judge Robert Bork's name into a verb and first weaponized the filibuster as a routine way of preventing a president from filling appeals court vacancies only in the last 15 years. Yet, they're right to point out that the current atmosphere in which there is no common ground between the parties is very, even as they become more and more alike, is very different from the way the Senate used to operate. The problem is not so much their pretense of virtue, but the refusal to recognize that the only way out of the current impasse is to recognize that Congress, without the filibuster rules change, will really cease to function. Not just effectively, but at all. It is in the nature of partisan politics that Democrats have to represent their attempt to demonize a mainstream and highly respected jurist like Neil Gorsuch as an expression of principle. So, too, is their continued effort to relitigate the refusal of Senate Republicans to even consider Barack Obama's nomination of Judge Merrick Garland last year, which was entirely within their constitutional prerogative. The stonewalling of Garland looked unreasonable politically, but in retrospect it was actually merciful. Had Garland been granted a hearing, he would have been subjected by Republicans to the same kind, well, doubtful actually, the same kind of unreasonable vilification and distortions of his record that Gorsuch just got from the Democrat. Nah, I don't think so. Republicans don't do things like that. Hell, Garland would probably have been confirmed. I mean, you think the Democrats couldn't have gotten 4 Republican senators? I mean, what? Susan Collins, John McCain, Lindsey Graham. I'm drawing up. Maybe Jeff Flake. I don't know. You think they couldn't have gotten 4 Republican senators to cross the aisle and vote for Garland? I bet they would have. That's that credit Mitch McConnell. He knew that too, which is why he just stuffed the Garland nomination, which again was within his, the Senate's constitutional prerogative. There's nothing in the Constitution that requires the Senate to hold hearings on a Supreme Court nominee. Nothing. If the Senate decides, well, we're not gonna hold a vote this year, they can do it. Now you can question whether it's politically wise, but there's nothing illegal about it or unconstitutional. The only difference is that Gorsuch suffered the ordeal secure in the knowledge that, thanks to the invocation of the nuclear option by Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, he would eventually be confirmed. Garland would have been put through the same, again, doubtful, torture, knowing that there was no chance he would ever sit on the Supreme Court. I think he would have been confirmed. It would have been close, but I think enough Republicans would have knuckled under to confirm him. At any rate, this is a function of our polarized politics. It is utterly disingenuous to claim, as Democrats are now doing, that filibusters are a force for bipartisanship because they require the parties to seek consensus. The inescapable fact about American politics in the early 21st century is that such consensus is no longer possible. The unwillingness of Republicans to consider a mainstream liberal, which means he wasn't in the mainstream, such as Garland, or for Democrats to make their peace with a mainstream conservative, such as Gorsuch, is a constitutionalist. Let's make sure we get the terminology correct. Is a comment on our bifurcated society. Americans no longer watch, listen to, or read the same media as their counterparts on the other side of the political aisle, and scorched earth political warfare is the inevitable result. Filibusters can't fix that, because there is no common ground left between two-party bases that think the worst of each other. All the requirement for a 60-vote Senate supermajority achieves is to thwart whichever side happens to be in charge on every possible issue. And when it comes to the legislative agenda, for which neither party has threatened to end the filibuster, that's not altogether a bad thing, even if it is frustrating. The founders of our republic intended to make change difficult. Remember, dividing power as much as possible. That's why our system has lasted as long as it has, because it makes wild, destabilizing policy swings and partisan swings very, very difficult. We designed it that way deliberately. And even they didn't think it would last very long. They'd be astonished to see it's lasted, almost a quarter of a millennium. And even if the filibuster wasn't part of the founders' plan for the Senate, it does fit in with the idea that it would act as a check on the House of Representatives, which is more likely to be swayed by the passions of the moment. But in our current political environment, the requirement of a supermajority simply means neither side can ever get a justice confirmed, no matter how highly qualified he or she may be, although the chances are much greater for Democrat Supreme Court nominees than their Republican counterparts. It is a given that had Hillary Clinton won in November, Republicans would have filibustered. Well, they wouldn't have had to have filibustered because they're still in the majority. Any nominee of hers, whether or not they retain their Senate majority. I'm not so sure. You can never assume that when it comes to Republicans. Given the fact that their liberal base doesn't accept the legitimacy of the election results or Trump, and Democrats were never going to give anyone he named to the court a chance either. The nuclear option was the only and painfully obvious remedy. Nor does it necessarily follow that majority rule is the thin edge of the wedge to tyranny on court nominations than on any other issue where we normally apply that rule. The arguments for or against retaining the filibuster have always been cynical. In the early 90s, the New York Times editorial page called for its abolition. Remember, that was in the first term of Bill Clinton, when Democrats had both houses of Congress as well as the White House. But a decade later, when it was useful to liberals fighting George W. Bush, the New York Times demanded the filibuster's retention. In other words, just pure partisan tribalism. Only a few years later, when Democrats won back the Senate in 2006, they flip-flopped again and denounced GOP obstructionism against the enlightened policies and nominees of Barack Hussein Obama. Now they again regard the filibuster as the last ditch of republicanism, since it is a way to thwart Trump. Where you stand on the issue of a filibuster has always depended on where you sit. So it's way past time for serious people to drop the hypocritical arguments. Understand that contemporary politics is not a gentleman's game, and adjust accordingly. Once they return to power at some point in the future, Democrats can and will use the fallout from this extension of the nuclear option to confirm judges they like. Conservatives won't like it, but as Barack Obama was fond of saying after his victories in 2008 and 2012, elections have consequences, or I won. Rather than the death knell of republicanism, recognition of that principle is the only way to allow it to go on functioning at a point in history when the two parties have so much in common.